we are in this COP and COP-MOP. We just call it COP and MOP, and never COP, MOP. And big decisions are going to be taken because we now know, I mean, the whole world, many of us, began this issue in the 80s when it was known as the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect. So that's how we started working on these issues, I think, in the early 80s. Now it's a climate crisis. But if we now have almost a consensus on climate science, there are still a few people who are crazy who deny that this whole thing is a crisis. Then we face the real crisis of what do we do about it, and how do we share the burden. And this is burden sharing, north and south, and within each country, the north and south within each country. Because if we don't get the equity right within any country, it's going to be very difficult to solve it. Why should the poor bear the burden when they see the people going around in Mercedes-Benz and fountains and so on, water flowing over, and they are asked to tighten it down? So the rich are going to be the problem in every country. I think that is it. The wealthy have to change their lifestyles downwards. The poor have to change their lifestyles too, upwards. They still have to grow upwards. They can't be denied that. And then worldwide, we do have this north-south thing. I mean, generally we just call it north-south. Because some countries are north-south, and some countries are south and north, and so on. And when we look at the data recently, many of us, not just from my organization, but we work with other organizations and we look at data and compare and so on, we are really shocked, and we feel very tragic about the data because we have used up so much of the world's atmosphere by polluting it with carbon dioxide, and we don't have much more to pollute. We can't pollute anymore. So people or countries that grew rich by polluting, now the poor countries can't take the same path. In fact, they are probably being asked to reduce their emissions as well. They have not been explicitly told. But if you look at the UNDP Human Development Report, there's a display of even the conference hall. One of the pages, 47 or 45, there's a graph there. And it's the same graph that Tom's organization has put out. It's the same table that we have put out. It shows that if we cut the emissions of the world by 50%, we need to survive at least 50% by 2005. And if the developed countries cut by 80%, which is already considered a miracle if you agree to that. Then the developing countries have to cut by 20%. Now, it's very difficult to tell developing countries that you have to absolutely go down. They may be willing to bend the curve in the sense that the rate of growth of my emissions, I try to slow it down, but to tell me that I will cut absolutely my emissions, I'm not against it in principle. But I don't know how to do it and still be able to meet my development needs. Somebody has to show me and tell me and convince me. Otherwise, what can I do about it? What can I do about it? This is really the dilemma. And if you compound it with population growth, then the emissions per person in developing countries have to go down by something like 50 to 60%. That's a hell of a lot. It's almost the same as in the developed countries because their population is not going to grow. So both sides have to cut per capita by about 60 to 70 or 80. Maybe the developed countries cut by 80 and the developing countries cut by 60 per capita in terms of per capita. So when you have countries whose per capita emissions are now 3 tons or 4 tons, and you tell them to cut by 60% per capita, I mean 4 to 5 tons per capita. Because if you cut by 50-60%, it's going to be very difficult to convince them to do so. And if your per capita emission is 1 ton per capita, which is India, and you tell them to cut by 60 to 70%, they say you are out of your mind. And if your per capita emission is 0.1 ton, which is Tanzania, and you tell them to cut by 60 to 70%, they say, what are you talking about? So you have to reorganize within the South. isn't it? Those who are at 4, you have to tell China, instead of cutting by 60 to 70%, the Chinese will say, you have to cut by 100% to allow Tanzania to grow from 0.1 to 1. They say, are you out of your mind? What? So, what has the South got to do to commit? I don't know. The great minds have not solved this. One, how to persuade countries to cut their per capita by, okay, I may be wrong, maybe it's not 60, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 30, still huge amounts. On average. And then the richer among them, or the more per capita emission among them, have to cut by even more, and so that those who are at 0.1, surely they are entitled to go to 0.4. If you go from 0.1 to 0.4, you are increasing your per capita emission by 300%. For someone to be able to increase by 300%, someone else has to go down by more than 60%. I don't see how this can be done today. We haven't even conceptualized it. We are talking about burden sharing among NX1, and you know how tough it is. Now, is Spain going to go up by how much? You see, they didn't meet their NX1 commitment, so in the second period, we had the 26% growth, which plus the 5 minus 5 they're supposed to do, so they should actually increase by an average of 20%, but then we add another 35% of the backlog, so that they have to go down by 45%. I mean, this is going to cause an explosion already within NX1, but they have experience in how to deal with this. It's tough, you shout, you yell, you almost kill each other, but at the end of the day, you drink a bottle of beer and you laugh. I mean, developed countries have a dispute settlement system. They know how to solve it and so on. Maybe because of all the wars in the South, I can't even imagine how we can think about a country accepting a target and everybody accepting burden sharing within the group. I mean, if we begin to start thinking about it, it's mind-boggling. But at the same time, climate change is serious, it's going to hit us. That's also mind-boggling. So we have two mind-bogglings. You see, life is complex, as they say. You don't get hit once, you get hit 2 or 3 at the same time. That makes it exciting, isn't it? You've got just 3 or 4 boxes and you don't know how to do it, and somehow it's got to be done. So what does it take to get a grand bargain going? Frankly, I have no answer. I just have questions. And I just want to pose these questions. Now, today this also came up in the trade and climate change meeting. We can't get into the big meeting, but as a concession, the trade minister of Indonesia invited those NGOs who told them that we want to get in and said, well, you can't get in, but I can talk to you for 2 hours. And she did. She was very gracious. Mary Pangis. She was from the research institute background, and now she's a minister. She's a very, very smart lady. And Indonesia is also the coordinator of something known as the Group of 33, which is actually 45 developing countries in the WTO that have very cleverly and eloquently advocated that free trade rules should not apply to food security of the developing countries. So where food products are concerned and other agricultural products where there are small farmers, then we should be exempted from the large tariff reductions that are mandated in this Doha round. And most of us in this crowd will say, yeah, that's a no-brainer. It should be so. If there are small farmers, livelihood protection, and food security, those countries should be exempted. The G33 is willing to cut something, but they're not willing to cut 40%. They may be willing to cut 10%, and for some products, 0%, because otherwise the farmers will go out of business. Indonesia is the leader, and she's the leader of the G33. So the question to us was, what do you as NGOs want to tell the ministers if you were in the room, and I will tell the ministers on your behalf? That's what the ministers said. And we were scratching our heads. What does that to say about trade and climate change? You know, it's a very tough question. I mean, you have northern NGOs who are campaigning for food miles. It's very complex. I mean, it sounds simple. You should eat as much as possible food grown in your own city or your own neighborhood, and don't import from another part of the country or from another country, because then the number of miles taken to fly the food to you will be reduced, and that's good for climate change. But if we were to apply that, in other words, don't buy food from other countries, okay, then there are many parts of the world, the poor parts of the world, that are exporting peanuts or rice or something. Their farmers will go bankrupt, and we will have a massive problem of unemployment among many of the farmers. So we tell our campaigners, in principle, yes, but in practice, can you think of a transition set of policies that can ensure that the poor, the small farmers and all that, whose products we don't want to eat anymore, are not affected adversely? There's a transition program so that they can transit out of the peanuts you don't want to get from Senegal anymore, and they can grow their own food or work in factories or whatever. If we don't have that transition policy and plan and program, then we are doing a set of policies that appear to be good immediately, but have very severe repercussions elsewhere in the world, and then we will be accused of being socially responsible for damaging other people's livelihoods and so on. It's very complex. So I was scratching my head, and then this is what I told the minister. And I think this gives the complexity of things to do in climate that have to be done outside the climate arena. Number one, it should not be, the temptation is, let us have the WTO change its rules so that countries can take trade measures on climate change grounds. For example, look at the product that is coming to your country. It will have a label which carries the carbon content, and if the carbon content is high, impose a very high tax, import tax. If the carbon content is zero, don't impose a tax, an additional tax. Right? It sounds very logical. Many people are thinking of this. Now the problem is, most developing countries have technologies that are outmoded, that are polluting, that are poor, that are inefficient, and that have a high carbon content, because they don't have the high technologies that are now in fashion, that is low carbon content. They don't have. So they are environmentally inefficient. What do we do then? Then we block their products from coming in. Or you have countries which are deforesting today. Very bad countries. So we punish them. But then they say, what about those countries that don't have any more trees because they deforested 50 to 200 years ago, and therefore we cannot punish them? So don't you allow us some development space within which we can have environmental performance lower than yours because we are not advanced enough. So all these kinds of issues come up, and therefore we should think very carefully before we say, let us slap on taxes on products, because number one, it may not be fair to those people today that because they are late in the development game, they are more polluting, and therefore they are now punished, even though they were not responsible for the stock of CO2 in the atmosphere. So therefore the principle is, do not do something that is protectionist against the poor, who will then have to bear another burden on top of the climate change burden that all of us say they are most vulnerable to. So that was the first advice to the minister. She said, of course, I know. So don't worry. The second is the EU-US proposal that is on the table today, which they put in the WTO last week, and which they will tell the media tomorrow, and tell all of us that they are offering this wonderful gift to all of us in climate change, and that is that proposal that for hundreds of environmental products, there should be zero tariff. And that for services that are environmental, water, maybe not water, energy, waste disposal, and many other services, countries should open their markets so that foreign companies can come in and provide the services. Now, what they are saying is not that we are encouraging you to have zero tariff and to open your services. They are saying it should be compulsory for all countries in the WTO. In other words, commit yourself to lower your tariff to zero and bind it there. In other words, you cannot go above zero anymore, and open your services market so that the foreign companies can come in and give you those services. On one hand, it sounds nice. They are imposing a discipline on the whole world because we are not clever enough to do it. And if left to do it ourselves, we may not. So we impose this law and everybody has to do it. Now, it shouldn't be seen as an offer. It's not that they are offering something. It's actually seen as a demand and a pressure for people to open up their markets so that the big companies that are first in the game can sell their products or their technologies, and those countries that are too weak have to accept the imports, and most likely in future they will not be able to have local industry to produce those things now. The analogy I can think of is food. Of course, it's better for countries if they can import food at zero tariff, and then the cheap food comes in, and people will have quote-unquote food security because you can buy food cheaper. But we are not demanding that. We are demanding the opposite. We are saying that for countries that have poor farmers, they should be able to put a tariff on their food import so that the farmers can continue their livelihood and the country can have food security in terms of producing its own. So taking that analogy to climate-related products and so on, the same too, countries aspire to produce their own products, even if they are inefficient. And of course, the other trick is many of the 700 products or many of the services that are listed down are not climate-related. It's just put in and sneak in so that you can enjoy a zero tariff and market access. The Brazilians are very angry because they've been trying to get biofuels into that list. Many of us like or don't like biofuel, but to them it is a climate-related product, and it's been rejected by the US. They said that's not climate-related, but many other things are climate-related. So it smacks of, I cherry-pick those things that are going to be beneficial to me. And the minister said, I don't think so, that's good. The third thing we said to the minister is, what is the best thing we can do in trade that can help climate? And the proposal we gave to her was, in the WTO today, there are many proposals by the developed countries to open up the markets of the developing countries, particularly in agriculture, food products, and in industry. The proposal is that, look, India, why are you defending your food? You should have almost zero tariff so that our food can all go and sell. And then the 500 million farmers don't know where to find the jobs. So we are saying they have to change their mentality if we want to fight climate change. Because in the climate change arena, we have a concept of vulnerability. And societies, communities, and countries that are vulnerable to climate change can be vulnerable in two ways. One is they are in the way of the climate. Hurricanes, heat, and so on. Secondly, their societies are so weak that when a climate event happens, they cannot resist, they cannot adapt. They don't have funds to adapt, or their societies are so weak, so they collapse faster. It's like immunity in the body. If I'm weak and malnourished, something comes in and I will die of flu. But if I have immunity, then the flu will go away. So can those countries that are putting pressure on the developing countries open up their agricultural markets, re-examine their policy, instead help those countries to become resilient economies and societies so that they can better fight climate change? And this applies in agriculture as well as in industries where the proposal is that we reduce our tariff very drastically. And many developing countries are worried that their local industries may not be able to survive. So the best thing that we can contribute on the trade side for climate change is to rethink our whole policy on trade so that it is more oriented towards sustainable development. And then we can build resilient economies in the developing countries so that they can really take on adaptation measures. The first adaptation measure is to have stronger societies and economies. Domestically, people have jobs, they have food, and they can then join in the effort to adapt and to mitigate. And I think this is what it takes for the South to be able to fight climate change. And if they can begin to fight climate change, later on they can take on commitments. Their first commitment is to make themselves more resilient and not vulnerable so that they can fight this climate change. And if they can fight climate change in their own country, that already would be a contribution. But if we put wrong commitments on them and wrong policies that will gear them towards wrong things, then we are not going to help them after all. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Martin. Let's take a couple of questions. regulation in conservation, something like that. But in implement.
So I think that the issue of the brand targeting I can take out first. I don't really see it sort of there so much. Maybe it will emerge. We're talking about sectoral commitment versus subsidy. Maybe the thing that is emerging is if we want to have access to technology, some countries have said it's possible to have it at an affordable price, whether through an exemption through patents for certain technologies, or if through development aid you purchase the license so that when I get the technology, I'm able to manufacture it myself and so on. So these are some things I think that are being discussed. It is not yet quite in the mainstream, but I do see. I mean, if you look at on the health side, the analogy that you have a declaration on trips and public health so that you can affordable medicine for the world. And if we are in an emergency situation, quite similar to a war, actually, I read an article yesterday somewhere that more people will die from climate change than from the two world wars of the last century. Therefore, we have a war situation. Then we, for this sector, at least the climate change sector, we may have to be, I think the demands will grow that we may have to relax certain rules so that people can have access to technology at a cheaper price that will enable them to accelerate the reform that they can carry out, at a much faster rate if they get the technology at a more affordable price. Kate was asking me, in fact, Kate, where's Kate? Yeah, thanks. Kate was one of those who educated us in Windsor Castle, if you remember. You gave this wonderful presentation, so I thank you for that. I did not say that the developing countries should not come in. Maybe I implied it by not addressing that question. It depends on what one means by commitment. In fact, as my own local organization in Malaysia, we hold our government accountable and we will get them to commit to national plans and so on. You have to take climate seriously, you have to get a cabinet committee going, you have to get the Prime Minister to chair it, because the environment ministry is too weak and will not be able to pull punches with other ministries. You have to set up the NGOs to get involved in the assembly, you have to do climate policy in transportation, in building, in agriculture, in industry, and everything. There has to be a massive change. You have to change the 5-year development plans, you have to look at the trade policy, you have to look at the policy of the banks and what loans they give out, we look at the infrastructure, you have to look at the deforestation. And I think this is where we come in. If we talk of commitments of the South, I think at this point the most important commitments is that those who know about this issue, we have to commit to change our society and change our government thinking and change the public opinion. Because if that doesn't happen, very, very little else can happen. I think that is what we need to do. Commitment begins with us. And I can say that where many of us are concerned, where we understand the climate science and the harm it's going to cause to our own society, we have to commit to do that. And we have to educate our public. Now, the commitments at the international side, it depends what we mean by the term commitment or obligations or efforts or contributions. That's why there are so many grades of these words, And if you say commitment as a legally binding thing, then somebody will say, no, I didn't mean legally binding. Yeah, okay, then commitment, legally binding commitment with sanctions against you if you don't mean it, including trade sanctions or military war against you, is the highest form of commitment, isn't it? I mean, the Security Council implements, the WTO implements. So if you commit to that degree, I commit to do this, and if I don't, please come and sanction me through trade or through bringing the military to come and discipline me, that would be the highest form of commitment. I don't think we are talking about that. We shouldn't be talking about that. Some people were talking about that in the past. Then you can have a commitment that is legally binding, but we don't know what the compliance mechanism is because it hasn't been worked out. Then we have a commitment that is not legally binding, but semi-legally binding because we have compliance, we have verifiable data with all kinds of things, but if you break it, we still don't know what to do, and maybe we won't do anything except to shame you. And then you have obligation because they are no longer commitments. That is, I say myself that I'm going to do this, and I'm going to open myself for you to peer review, and it's all in goodwill. You're not going to kill me for this, and I'm not going to die if I don't do it, but I commit, and I welcome you to peer review me through a review mechanism. That's another form of obligation, I would say, something attached that is a peer review. And then something else where you sort of commit through some paper, but if you don't follow, nobody bothers to check, and so on and so forth, which is probably what we now have in the international communication that we now have, and so on and so forth. So I'm saying there are many grades of this. At which stage should we move from a very soft kind of rhetorical commitment to one which is one step up to another step and so on, and to what extent should different types of countries take on different kinds of obligations, which I think you were alluding to in terms of differentiation, say, between the developing countries. So I think all these issues are now on the table and they are on the cards. I'm not rejecting any of them. But when you say Korea, Singapore, they are the most obvious. Korea is an OECD member. Singapore is a high per capita income. But what criteria do we use? Do we use per capita income? Do we use per capita emission? What about countries with high per capita income but low emissions? What about countries that have high per capita income and high emissions? You get into a lot of mess. I mean, I've seen one study on differentiation in climate change where the results are totally counterintuitive, which I was shocked myself. You have highly industrialized developing countries, rapidly industrializing developing countries, and LDCs. And who are the ones in category 1 and 2? The small island states. Small island states, Trinidad, Barbados, and China is category 3. Okay. So I said, this can't be. I mean, we are trying to catch China. We're not trying to catch Barbados. They are the victims. But you see, they have very small population, so their GNP per capita is very high, much higher than China. So it has to be sorted out. It's a big mess. I know because I sit in some committee in the UN that tries to see who is an LDC and who is not. That's the only category the UN now acknowledges in terms of income. And I can tell you there's a big fight going on in there. Samoa graduated and is no longer an LDC. They appeal and say we are still an LDC because we are very vulnerable, especially to climate change. And I agreed with them, but the committee said, I'm sorry, the criteria is such, how you go? You're no longer an LDC. They say, we are still an LDC because you lose a lot of privileges if you're not an LDC. So even who is an LDC becomes a problem. So what is a rapidly industrializing country? What is an industrialized developing country? What is a middle-income developing country? Where does China stand or where does India stand? India actually, most parts of India are as poor as Africa or even poorer. It just so happens it became one country. Maybe 2/3 of it is an LDC and 1/3 is not. So we get into all this categorization. I agree that we need to do something, but I don't think it can be solved in 2 years. It will get so locked down. Does that mean that we shouldn't do anything? No, I think we should do something. What should we do? I know what the mess is if you start getting into differentiation. I don't know what the solution is because I read your definition, I read the definition of this other institute, and so I have no answer. I just throw out these questions really. At this stage, to be very frank. Doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge it's a problem or that I think that people shouldn't commit. They should commit. But whether they should commit now, legally, binding, and so on, I don't think this is the time for that.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thanks for spending the time.